We're really pleased to have with us today Dr. David Coall, who is a senior researcher, lecturer, and human biology course coordinator in the biomedical sciences within the School of Medical and Health Sciences at Edith Cowan University in Perth, Western Australia. So David has a new book, Mort, out on contemporary and traditional Aboriginal family systems, and I've put the link for that just below in the description of the YouTube video. And he also has a really interesting new paper just out last week showing that maternal grandmothers keep investing in grandchildren who experienced early stress. So I really encourage all of you to go and read that. Please feel free to ask questions during the talk in the chat box, and we will ask them at the end of the talk. If you don't have a YouTube account, that's okay, because we've put a link to a Google form, and you can use that to ask any questions, and I will pop them into the chat myself. So don't worry, and please do ask questions. For now, I'm going to hand over to David. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much, Gabriella. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you and Paula for the opportunity to speak with everyone today. Today, I know that many of you are postgraduate students, undergraduate students. So what I'd like to do is take you through a little bit of a journey on some of the ideas I've had around evolutionary theory and applying it to understanding pregnancy, looking at birth weight, and particularly looking at placental adaptation. And as part of this, I'd like to run through a life history theory model that I've been working on for a few years. I'm very happy to take comments at the end of the talk and any clarifications that anyone would like. And I've also got a little methodological section where I was really trying to think about how to measure placental adaptation. So this is using actual photos of placentas and digital analysis. And hopefully that'll give you some ideas about thinking in detail about how you want to measure something as you're going through your research. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm delivering this talk today from Noongar land. So the Noongar people of Western Australia are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting, and I'd like to pay respect to their elders past and present, and particularly because from an evolutionary perspective, thinking about the role of family and culture and how this has given Noongar people such strong resilience to last thousands of years and through recent oppression. And just to make sure that I am able to do this and I don't have to rush off before the last slide, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators, particularly my postgraduate students, Julie Satori, Michelle Tickner, Elsa Chu, Lisa Mottram, and my collaborators, Anna Callan and Enoch Anto, and my long-term research mentor, Jim Chisholm, and Adrian Charles, who's the pediatric pathologist who taught me a lot about placental research methodologies. So we're looking at evolutionary theory and how we apply this to understanding or helping our further understanding of medicine and biomedical science. Hopefully you're already thinking about the role that medicine plays in this, and medicine is crucial to this. So the evolutionary perspective is really an add-on to what we already know and we're continuing to understand in biomedicine. And what it adds to this is a thinking about why are the things the way they are? Why do they fail the way they do? And how can we then develop interventions that might be able to address this? Now, evolution has been discussed for a long time in terms of its contributions that it's made to other disciplines. In the past, its contribution to biology has been really highlighted by Dobzhansky, showing its value as creating a framework and synthesizing ideas from different disciplines some aspects of evolutionary theory create predictive tools, so they generate hypotheses, and from this, hopefully, we can develop some new interventions and preventions. And we can see this famous quote here, and I think that we could now replace biology with medicine. Obviously, medicine all by itself has fundamental value, but evolutionary theory can help us understand various aspects of medicine that people don't necessarily link together. And particularly, hopefully, I'll be able to show you this as we look through the life course today. So, pregnancy, gestation, fetal growth, how important is this for medicine? This is crucial for medicine. Most countries focus very strongly on the health of their pregnancies and the health of their offspring. And this is reflected by the World Health Organization and their use of the percentage of low birth weight babies as key health indicators. So one of the 100 core health indicators, and it's also used as part of the global nutrition monitoring framework. So you can see that there are actual goals set about trying to maintain low levels of low birth weight and reduce these rates around the world. Many of you will have heard a phrase that low birth weight is associated with an increased risk of morbidity and mortality for the neonate, but many of you may not have seen any statistics related to that. So I thought I would share this slide with you where you can see that babies that were born in the lower third percentile of all birth weights, when compared to babies that were born between the 26th and the 75th percentile, they had significantly higher rates of low APGAR scores, blood acidity, intubation, seizures in the first 24 hours, sepsis, and death within the first month. So this really is significant and remains a significant issue in all cultures around the world. An interesting thing about the relationship between mortality and birth weight is that although with medical intervention, the mortality rates associated with birth weight are dropping over time, it's very interesting that the fundamental relationship between mortality and birth weight still remains. So there's really is this variation in birth weight is crucial for health and well-being. And many of you will be aware of the Barker hypothesis, or the developmental origins of health and disease paradigm, which has become extremely famous since the early 1990s and was driven early on by some original work from David Barker that linked birth weight with adult risk of disease. And here is an example of that, where we have an increased risk of mortality from ischemic heart disease associated with reductions in birth weight. And you can see that this study is particularly useful because it actually adjusts for crucial factors that influence birth weight, such as socioeconomic status, and it is able to adjust for them at birth and later in life and towards the end of life as well. So this does seem to be quite a robust finding, and it's so robust that there is now an extensive animal research endeavour that is part of DOHAD, where interventions such as reduced nutrition and administration of synthetic glucocorticoids during pregnancy in animal models is being used to try and really find out what the mechanisms are that are underlying this DOHAD paradigm. Now, equally, if we look at the significance of birth weight and fetal growth for evolution, it's really obvious. Clearly, a healthy pregnancy is crucial for survival and reproduction, and therefore underpins our understanding of factors that influence inclusive fitness and differential survival and reproduction. In terms of parental investment, which is a measure often used within evolutionary biology to try and understand the amount of investment that a parent is making in an offspring, for me, birth weight really epitomizes and holds all the key characteristics of parental investment. So you can see it's investment by one parent in one offspring. It increases the offspring's chances of survival and reduces the parent's ability to invest in other offspring. So for me, birth weight provides an excellent opportunity to really nail down parental investment and investigate that variable within families. And something that really highlights just how valuable fetal growth is from an evolutionary perspective is how heavily it is buffered against the environment. So where in the lay media, we always hear about the influence of nutrition and smoking on pregnancy. And these are very significant aspects, but in our Western environment that many of us may be living in, the environmental variation is much lower than it has been in our evolutionary past. And so to give you some idea of the buffering that is provided to protect fetal growth, here we have a study I believe from Great Ormond Street Hospital, some of the authors here. And you can see that we have a relationship between countries and the investment in terms of energy, so millijoules. And this is in reference to pregnancy. So you can see on the left, we have high resource countries like Sweden, England, the Netherlands, through to countries on the right, such as the Gambia, with lower resource availability. And we have S for supplemented and U for unsupplemented. So you may remember the presentation in this series by Grazina Jazienska. This is a similar study, same group looking at pregnancy. And on the graph on the left, you can see that to maintain pregnancy varies with the resource availability in the environment. So as the resource availability falls, less resources are required to maintain pregnancy. And you can see that in the unsupplemented group, there's actually resources are being taken from the mother herself to supplement pregnancy. Again, in terms of the fat deposition that the mother is putting down during pregnancy, again, in the unsupplemented group, because the energy is being used for maintenance, then we actually are losing body fat during pregnancy. And so you can see that the total cost of pregnancy in an unsupplemented environment, so a low resource environment, is completely buffered by the mother's own physiology. And so that then, you can imagine, has consequences for her condition and for her interbirth interval and the time until she has her next baby. So you can see how that really strongly reflects parental investment. And we're familiar with the idea that nutrition influences fetal growth and pregnancy, but actually understanding that variation across countries is quite difficult to do. So again, we have the same countries from our high resource environments to our low resource environments. We can see on the left that birth weight falls as our resource availability falls. in the middle, we can see that birth weight as a percentage of the weight that the mother gains during pregnancy increases dramatically in low resource environments. But interestingly, when we take birth weight as a proportion of the mother's weight, you can see that this is constant across different environments. So this really shows how across these different environments with very different resource availabilities, our physiology is able to buffer our pregnancies and our fetal growth. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that therefore we should stop trying to intervene, but it just gives us a really good idea of the variation that we are trying to deal with and how very difficult and challenging environments that still enable reproduction. Okay, so birth weight seems amazing from this perspective, all of the different roles that it plays in health and evolution. But we need to think really closely about what we're talking about. So what are we measuring? So does birth weight really do all of these things? And we know that birth weight is easily accessible. It's in all medical records. Many countries now have electronic databases where they record everyone's birth weight, and they use this for national statistics. But birth weight is not the thing that is influencing health. It's not the thing that's influencing the risk of adult disease. What is important is whatever is influencing the mother's physiology or the fetal physiology and changing that growth, whether that be during pregnancy or before pregnancy. So what we really want to know, although birth weight is a really handy proxy for what we want to know, what we really want to know is what changes and affects birth weight. And so this is the question that sent me on a journey of many years trying to work out what can we do with the placenta to understand how the placenta mediates this variation between maternal physiology and a fetal growth. So it's clear, it's already well established that fetal growth tracks with placental growth throughout pregnancy. Late in pregnancy, the placenta starts to lose its efficiency, its ability to support increases in birth weight. And you can see that after term, so after 42 weeks, there is, if that pregnancy does continue, both placental weight and fetal weight will decline. So what is interesting is that in many situations where we have an environmental insult, it doesn't necessarily visibly impact birth weight. It may actually impact placental weight and placental growth and placental efficiency, and then the placenta is able to buffer the fetal growth from those environmental impacts. So again, thinking about the variation in our evolutionary history that our uterine environment would have experienced. So one way that this is picked up is by a change in placental weight relative to fetal weight. So this is a placental weight to fetal weight ratio. And this is used as a marker for placental efficiency and for changes in the uterine environment that then may need placental adaptation. And interestingly, like birth weight, it has been associated with the risk of adult disease. Indeed, some studies have shown that it's actually the combination of birth weight and placenta weight that is associated with the highest risk of adult disease. So here you can see babies that are born small with a large placenta actually have the highest rate of systolic blood pressure in adulthood. So you can see here that maybe the requirement for the placenta to adapt to the uterine environment actually puts subsequent physiology for risk later in life. So there is something called compensatory placental growth. So this is when we get an increased placental weight relative to fetal weight, and this has been seen in response to a range of environmental challenges, like reasonably common environmental challenges such as reduced nutrition, reduced oxygen supply. And specifically, a larger placental weight has been recorded in association with maternal anemia, higher altitude, and other factors that may slightly reduce fetal growth, such as reproductive technologies. So one factor that we've been interested in to see if this is also associated with changes in placental weight is morning sickness. So when we think about things that may be worth investigating from an evolutionary perspective that may influence variation in something like pregnancy, it's really useful if it is something that is experienced by most individuals, and morning sickness falls into this category really, really precisely. So we're quite interested in the impact that morning sickness has on the uterine environment and on placental adaptation. And so this is one part of a very big puzzle. So I included this slide just to show you some of the complexities associated with looking at placental growth and development and physiology. Today, what I'll be talking about is the gross placenta, so virtually the anatomy of the gross placenta. But this is something I'm trying to use as a shortcut or a proxy for the vast amounts of physiology that are varying within the placenta, influencing the placental phenotype, and ultimately some studies have shown that this variation does influence disease states later in life. Okay, so what evidence is there that these changes in placental physiology or fetal growth could be adaptive? So a really useful paradigm for looking at variations in life cycle and life stages is life history theory. So this enables us to look at the environment and the impact the environment has on the development and timing of life phases. And when we consider birth weight or size at birth, this is a crucial life history trait. So you can see how the length of time something has to grow or the speed at which it grows will immediately impact size at birth. So a really good example of this is provided by the Western spadefoot toad. Here we have a desert toad that lives underground until water is available. Then they reproduce. Tadpoles develop in the pond or the water that is available. And then they need to be able to develop to a point where they're able to survive outside of water and dig a burrow so that they're able to bury themselves again. So you can see how this life cycle is completely dependent on being able to respond to changes in the environment. So as the pond dries up, if the toad isn't able to adjust at the speed at which it develops, it would have enormous trouble surviving and reproducing. And there's really good evidence that the influence of a pond drying up stimulates the release of hormones within the tadpoles, specifically corticotrophin releasing hormone, that speeds up growth and enables them to be able to survive outside of the water. So for me, that's a really clear example, and hopefully this translates into a human example for you. So if we think of our human life cycle And as the environment changes, perhaps we're in an environment where life expectancy is shorter, early risk is higher, then it makes sense that we would be able to adjust our life cycle so that we grow and develop faster, we reach sexual maturity at a younger age, and which enables us to reproduce before we die. And so hopefully that makes sense with those two examples. Now, a lot of people have been working on a synthesis between developmental psychology and evolutionary theory that has been underway since the early 1990s, and looking at early environmental stress in humans and the impact that it has on reproductive development and timing. So what I'd like to do now is show you a life history model that I've been working on that takes that developmental evolutionary psychology model and extends it to examine its impact on maternal physiology and pregnancy outcomes. So some of you may have heard of this paradigm before. It's an early stress model of reproductive timing and development. And the hypothesis is that higher levels of psychosocial stress early in childhood, which might reflect increased environmental risk or at least changes in resource availability, will be associated with accelerated reproductive development and timing. And that this reproductive development and timing, so the extension that I've been working on, is the idea that this would then influence maternal trade-offs in terms of her physiological decision-making in terms of reproduction. So it may be associated with increased body mass index, so increased investment in the soma, and a reduced flow of resources to the fetus. So under these environments with of higher risk and higher mortality, it may be adaptive to produce more offspring, ensuring that some survive, but reducing the amount of investment in each offspring because you can't be certain that you can help them survive. Okay, and the final step in this hypothesis is that because the mother and the fetus do not have exactly the same inclusive fitness goals, we can expect that if the mother's physiology reduces the flow of resources to the fetus, that the fetoplacental unit will respond and try and manipulate those resources. And one way that we can see evidence of this is our compensatory placental growth that we've been talking about. So an increased placental weight to fetal weight ratio. If you haven't come across these ideas before, there's an excellent work by David Haig, who has looked at several aspects of pregnancy physiology and possible conflict between the fetus and the mother during pregnancy. So it's really useful if you're interested in this area to follow that up. Okay, so what we're particularly interested in is trying to work out what is a good measure of this maternal trade-off. And for, as I mentioned earlier, one of the measures that we think really reflects this change in resource availability or resource partitioning is morning sickness. So just a little bit about morning sickness. As you may be aware, most people experience morning sickness during pregnancy. Up to about 90% has been reported. And for most people, this is emesis gravidarum. So we have some nausea, some vomiting, maybe retching, maybe food avoidance. And In severe cases, individuals can actually be hospitalized for this because of their loss of fluid and their lack of nutrition, and they may be receive care in a hospital to reverse this situation. And this is referred to as hypermesis gravidarum. So here we have severe nausea and vomiting. It's not very common, but it persists for the entire pregnancy and does result in hospitalization. So the clinical classification you can see there includes the timing, the different types of so nausea, vomiting, retching, frequency, the duration, and the intensity. And clearly, food avoidance, nausea, vomiting are likely to influence the availability of resources during pregnancy. Now, morning sickness is a fascinating area. It is something where you think there must be thousands of people around the world researching this. And my PhD student, Julie Satori, is doing a fantastic job of trying to marshal all of the information that we have available on morning sickness. And there are many different theories and many hypotheses about the role of morning sickness during pregnancy. And some of these are adaptive hypotheses where it's seen as potentially protecting the fetus from noxious elements in the environment, or potentially being crucial for accelerating placental growth and then maintaining fetal growth. But at the moment, the cause of morning sickness has not been identified, and this strikes us as something that needs to be remedied and quick, and we're working on the pathophysiology of morning sickness at the moment. So there are a range of risk factors associated with morning sickness, so people who experience motion sickness or experience sickness after surgery, so after, say, a general anesthetic, for example, seem to be at a higher risk of morning sickness. So there's clearly some pathways that are shared there with other, I guess, clinical manifestations. But we think that this role of morning sickness and its petitioning of resources to the fetus may be really usefully conceived within a reproductive strategy. So again, one way that an individual pursuing a current reproductive strategy may limit fetal growth is through morning sickness. So our first hypothesis is that morning sickness will be associated with reduced fetal growth, increased placental growth in response to that, and an increased placental weight to fetal weight ratio. A subsequent hypothesis would be that this is in turn associated with an indication of early reproductive development and timing, and that this should also be conditional on the early environment. So, be more likely in an environment of high risk and uncertainty, or increased childhood psychosocial stress. So I'm going to show you some data here from a study that was conducted in Western Australia. This study we've just replicated. In this original study, we only collected images of the placentas. We've just finished a study where we've collected another 600 placentas, and this time we've collected placental tissue as well. So we're ready to start looking at actual physiology to build on from what I'm presenting today. So the mothers completed a questionnaire about their childhood environment, family environment, reproductive history. they gave us permission to access their medical records and to collect their placenta. Okay, just a quick warning. I know that in some parts of the world you may be having breakfast with this, so I am about to show some placenta photos, real placenta photos, not much blood, just placentas. Okay, so here's a placenta. If you haven't met one before, you can see this is referred to as the fetal surface. So you can see the umbilical cord there, which the baby is attached to, and you can see the membranes there which fold up, and that provides the amniotic sac that we all floated around in for about 9 months. So when we looked at these placentas, we did a physical analysis, so weighed, measured each placenta, and then we also took a range of digital photographs of each placenta and analysed those on the right so we could get an understanding of surface area and a range of other things. So here you can see that there's very strong association between placenta weight and birth weight, as we would expect. And here's a little bit of data about these pregnancies. You can see 7% had severe morning sickness, and we have complete data for 536 mothers. And we limited this so they were only first-time mothers. So we don't have issues of parity to deal with here. And you can see a range of aspects of biology and psychology associated with that are likely to be associated with morning sickness and pregnancy. So our first hypothesis was that morning sickness will be associated with reduced birth weight and an increased placenta weight to fetal weight ratio. And interestingly, even with this reasonably small sample size, morning sickness was associated with increased placenta weight and an increased placenta weight to fetal weight ratio, but it wasn't associated with a change in birth weight. So on the surface value, that does suggest that maybe the placenta was able to buffer fetal growth against morning sickness. Second hypothesis, maternal factors associated with a current reproductive strategy will be associated with maternal factors that may result in or be associated with a reduced flow of resources to the fetus. So aspects of behavior and biology being associated with morning sickness. So again, we're trying to get a handle on whether there's a range of factors that might be reducing the flow of resources to the fetus. So here we can see in the bivariate analysis that younger mothers with a higher body mass index, more depressive symptoms, and high medication categories. So these are people who are taking medications during pregnancy that are known to be a risk to fetal growth. So, so you can see that this is a purely biological variable that may be reducing fetal growth, and we may have, it may be associated with morning sickness or other conditions, and also it may then be associated with a placental response. And something that in terms of everyday factors that have a very strong influence on fetal growth and placenta weight is the mother's own birth weight. So there's very strong association between a mother's own birth weight and the birth weight of her offspring. Okay, and then we entered all of these together in a multivariate model, and you can see that they all remained in the model. So it looks like each of these has an independent contribution to understanding morning sickness. So that was quite a surprise to us, because you can see that a range of these variables look like they're interrelated, and we really felt that there may be some masking happening here, and there's no collinearity to worry about either. Okay, hypothesis 3 would be that further back in the mother's environment, so her early childhood environment, would be associated with an increased risk of morning sickness. So it is actually the childhood psychosocial environment that may be influencing the flow of resources to the fetus. Okay, so again, we have the same variables that we just looked at. We've added in childhood psychosocial stress. So these are major stresses such as parental divorce, parental incarceration, abuse, hospitalization. So a range of major stresses that individuals may have experienced during their childhood. And you can see that in the bivariate model, early stress was associated with an increased risk of morning sickness. And you can see that in the adjusted model, with early stress included, that the only variable that was not remaining in the model was early stress. So we need to look at this in more detail, but it does suggest that there may be the potential for some mediation happening between early stress, the maternal physiological factors that may be associated with reduced flow of resources to the fetus, and placental weight to fetal weight ratio. Okay, now what about the placenta? So again, now we've got the same model, but this time our outcome variable is placental weight. And you can see that for placental weight, again, the majority of variables that represent a reduced flow of resources to the fetus are associated with increased placental weight. And if we then extend that to placental weight to fetal weight ratio, we can see that both early stress and maternal age, so higher levels of early stress and a younger maternal age, are both associated with an increased placental weight to fetal weight ratio. And we can see that some variables such as depression symptomatology drops out, but the high medication category and mother's own birth weight are still contributing a little bit to these models. Okay, but I guess we should emphasize that not a lot of the variance in placental weight to fetal weight ratio is being explained by this model. Okay, so now we have this idea that maybe the early psychosocial environment could be influencing fetal growth via maternal physiology. But again, we need to stop and think, is this really possible? So what are we thinking here? That there's some change in physiology that is passed intergenerationally through the mother, and is there evidence to support this from other placental studies? So here is a very interesting study that again looked at childhood trauma and subsequent placental physiology. And it is interesting that the hormone being examined is considered a stress hormone, and some people feel is associated with gestational age during pregnancy, so higher levels of corticotrophin releasing hormone associated with earlier delivery, shorter gestational age. And you might remember back when I was talking about toads, that the hormone that mediated the drying pool and the speeding up of the development of the tadpole was corticotrophin-releasing hormone as well. Now, I don't know enough about this to suggest that this is a conserved aspect of physiology. I will definitely need to do more investigation on that. But you can see here that corticotrophin-releasing hormone measured across pregnancy. You can see that for the individuals who experienced one or more traumatic events during childhood, the rate of increase of corticotrophin-releasing hormone is higher and is faster than it is for individuals who didn't experience any traumatic events, well, events that were measured. And we can see then, if we average that across pregnancy, that there's quite a large difference in this corticotrophin releasing hormone. So this provides evidence that such an impact of the early environment is possible, but we do need to gain additional evidence to support this. Something else that we need to think about, so we're trying to be critical about what we're doing here, is to think about, okay, so it might be possible, but is it likely to be universal? So early on, I started speaking about the great variability of environments that pregnancies are successful under and our relatively new environment that we're experiencing in weird societies. And there's a very common association found in this early stress literature that females who grow up in a household where the father is absent, generally due to divorce, is associated with an accelerated reproductive development. Now, in this paper where we reviewed the literature, we were able to show that that association mainly held for females who were growing up in weird societies, so Western high resource societies, and it tended to dissipate for women who were developing in other environments. And so we felt that this is likely to do with the larger impact of energy availability on reproductive timing and development, rather than the impact of the psychosocial environment. So it may be likely that an association like this may only be visible in populations where pregnancy is already receiving a high level of resources and is then able to petition those resources in more detail. And this additional evidence that supports that this association might vary across different populations is that in this study, we didn't find an effect of socioeconomic status. So this is quite a common factor that influences birth weight. In this study, we didn't find that, suggesting that maybe this is quite an affluent population. As I mentioned earlier, morning sickness is a very exciting area to start thinking about. And as Julie's been working through the morning sickness literature, it's become really clear that people don't really know what morning sickness is, and clinically, it's not defined very well. So as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about nausea, vomiting, retching, food avoidance. It's likely that several of these are on different pathways. Many pregnancies are extremely variable in which of these they experience. One may have only food avoidance with none of the others. So we're really trying to start to unpack this and work out whether maybe the resource availability is really associated with vomiting and food avoidance, but nausea and retching do not produce the same effect. So we're really trying to look at that detail. Okay, and right at the start, I mentioned that I would like to share some ideas I have with you on measuring placental adaptation to the fetal environment. So here we do have a few gross placenta pictures. And this is, at the moment, this is purely an idea, and I'm very happy to take comments on this. But I was thinking weight by itself, again, is not an excellent measure of placental adaptation to the fetal environment. And without physiological measures, I was thinking, what else can I do? So I'm looking at the gross anatomy. So I'll quickly talk about what we do when we're looking at a gross placenta. So here, again, we have our placenta, we have our fetal surface, and the underside is referred to as the maternal surface, and this is the surface that is in contact with the uterus. So the only temporary organism in the human body, and through the magic of oxytocin and muscle contraction, is often, generally, most of the time, able to disconnect from the uterine lining at the end of pregnancy safely. But when we're looking at it, there are many characteristics that we might see, such as the membranes. So here you can see some membranes are different colors. So for example, I don't know if that comes up as green on the right there, suggesting that there's some form of infection that again may influence fetal growth and placental development. Those of you who have thought about placentas before, and you might have seen a picture in a textbook, it's always round and neat, like I showed you in the first slide. And here you can see the enormous variation that placentas have. And I'd like to remind you that this is a healthy population. So these are not high-risk pregnancies at all. These are just normal, everyday pregnancies with a low disease risk and disease incidence. So quite a lot of variation. And then where the cord insert is also highly variable. So here you can see some insert in the middle, some towards the edge, some right on the edge, and some insert actually in the membranes, and then the blood vessels run through the membranes to get to the placenta. And this is a very high risk situation, particularly during delivery, and is a really good reason to not break the amnion, particularly with a sharp object. Okay, so this is fascinating, and this situation is referred to as a Velamentous cord insertion, where it implants into the membrane. So now it's highly likely that the placenta didn't start developing like this, and that there's been some change within the uterine environment that has caused this change in development. And there's a couple of theories. One is that it's to do with the implantation of the embryo, and another, well, which we can't measure, and another is referred to as trophotropism. So this may be familiar to some of you as the idea of something moving towards or away from a high nutrition environment. And so the idea being that where there's membrane and there are blood vessels, there was placenta, and now that has been reabsorbed because of poor nutrition, and we have an area with low nutrition. Okay, the animation is not working in this, so I don't know if I've done something wrong, but I'll try and explain this picture to you. So the first thing is the placenta. So the general assumption is that most placentas begin round, circular, and they actually cover most of the uterine lining early in pregnancy. And we would expect that if it is round, it has an equal distribution of blood vessels across its surface. And then you can imagine that in the top, where the grey arrows are, we might have an area of low nutrition uterine environment where the placenta starts to die off and reabsorb. And where the green is, we might have an area of high nutrition. So the placenta might start to grow down towards the left into this environment. And I was thinking, can we actually, from our photos, measure this variation? And so what we would need to be able to see on this placenta are three things. We'd need to be able to see that there were blood vessels there in the first place. So sometimes there wouldn't be blood vessels and it would die from no nutrition availability. So we need to be able to see that blood vessels were there. We also need to, so here I've outlined the blood vessels that were there and have now started to be reabsorbed. And we'd also need to be able to show that on the maternal surface of the placenta that there has been some reabsorption happening. So you can see this very thick connective tissue that remains on the placenta after the parenchyma, so the placental cake has been reabsorbed. And so have we got an even distribution of blood vessels? Have we got presence of reabsorbed blood vessels on the shortest distance between the cord and the circumference? And do we have evidence of reabsorption? And so if we do have this, I refer to this as placental migration. And I thought, so what is something that is well known to impact fetal growth that placental adaptation may be able to buffer birth weight against? And my initial thought was smoking during pregnancy. So this study was conducted long enough ago that people still voluntarily admitted that they smoked during pregnancy. And now people are less and less likely to admit that they smoke during pregnancy. So here you can see in the green bars, we have pregnancies in the study where there was no smoking, and you can see similar levels of birth weight. And on the pink bars, you can see that we have smoking in these pregnancies. On the left, we have no evidence of placentas with no evidence of placental migration. And on the right, we have placentas where there was evidence of placental migration. And we can see that in placentas where there was evidence of placental migration, there seems to be an increased birth weight back up to the level of no smoking during pregnancy. So again, this is something that I haven't published yet. This is an idea about how to try and narrow down how you measure something, but I think it's worth thinking about this level of detail when you have the data available. Okay. Now, my last point I would like to make is that within this area of applying evolutionary theory to understanding developmental origins of health and adult disease, there's a paradigm referred to as predictive adaptive responses. So the idea that the early environment, in cases where the early environment reflects the later adult environment, that consistency of the environment between those two life stages benefits the health and well-being of the individual, because the physiology that developed during pregnancy matches the physiology that will be required as an adult. And hopefully today, I've shown you that when we start thinking about the mother's life cycle, not only the offspring's life cycle, that we really need to expand what we consider the early environment to be, and it needs to extend beyond pregnancy, the pregnancy itself and its physiology, but also into the mother's own development and potentially the development of her recent ancestors as well. So there is an area where people are investigating whether these connections between the early environment and the later environment are predictive and adaptive, but there's also a range of adaptations that or developmental changes that are not adaptive at all but are disruptive. So we need to keep that in mind. A great researcher I've always admired, Patrick Bateson, articulated this very well in his book and explained it as a weather forecast. So if the early environment matches the later environment, everything's fine, and there should be an improvement in health and survival. If the environment doesn't match, as we have in this situation where the environment doesn't match, so the top left-hand corner, you can see we've got babies that had a low ponderal index at birth and a high body mass index at 11 years of age. They had the highest risk of high blood pressure as adults. So when those two environments don't match, we have an increased risk of poorer outcomes in adulthood. So hopefully this gives you some ideas to think about in terms of predictive adaptive responses, thinking about which environments are the organisms responding to. Shouldn't the organism respond to as many environments as possible? So this is from the work of Daniel Nettle and his modelling. We need to think about ancestors as well as the current pregnancy, and the importance of survival over matching of environments is crucial. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. Hopefully this gives you some new ideas on how to look at birth weight, maybe considering it as part of a reproductive strategy, and it brings together a range of maternal and fetal characteristics that you might not have put together in the past. In the very least, it improves our understanding of variation that happens during pregnancy and possible consequences for disease, and extends our understanding of what the environment actually is that we should be paying attention to. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, David, for a really, really interesting talk. We've got some great questions coming in already on the form. I'm just going to remove the slides. So I'm going to go ahead and start asking, and if people watching have more questions, please feel free to just add to them, and I'll just go from the first questions asked. So, and I'm going to pop them up on the screen here.
I'm still here. I just the lighting is movement activated, and I sat still for way too long.
Okay, so a first question is, what are the mechanisms that enable in utero conditions to manifest so much later on? Is the damage done early, or is there some other pathway that leads to disease decades later?
That's a great question. So this is something that a lot of people across disciplines are working on. Some of you may know that the Barker hypothesis and the DOHAD paradigm was also referred to as fetal programming for a while. Some people don't like that, but that is the idea that there's a fundamental change in physiology that is carried through the lifespan. However, other people believe strongly that not only is physiology changing, but also behavior is changing. So some of these disease risks may actually be maintained through behavior and not only physiology. So there's a lot of work being done in this area, but it's not entirely conclusive at the moment.
Thank you. Okay, next question. How much can breastfeeding offset birth weight deficiency? Do mothers of low weight babies breastfeed for longer?
Excellent. So breastfeeding is another ideal example of parental investment. I believe it fits the definition really closely. And I guess there's the relationship between low birth weight and breastfeeding is complicated because of cultural factors. So it is true that some of the interventions that are used for low birth weight and preterm babies include making sure that they're carried, making sure that they're close to the mother all of the time to increase the chances of breastfeeding and maintaining breastfeeding. However, in some hospital situations, particularly, well, obviously, if there's a risk to the baby, it's going to be taken away and go to an intensive care unit, which really reduces the risk, the chances of establishing early breastfeeding. And that really seems to be crucial for the maintenance of breastfeeding. So you can see that ideally, everyone tries to counterbalance low birth weight with the food that is perfectly designed for developing babies, but sometimes there are cultural factors that influence the initiation of that.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to morning sickness, can you speak more about the effects of parity? Are later-born infants smaller at birth? How does morning sickness change across parities?
Okay, so this is a really good natural experiment. So as part of the study I was talking about, we restricted it to first-time mothers to try and remove some of this effect, but then we found out that a lot of them had previous pregnancies, but that didn't go to term. So that was a real eye-opener for us for the number of people involved. And so if you look at a big birth cohort study and birth order, you find that first baby, well, no, the first baby doesn't count. So it looks like there's some type of placental priming that happens with the first baby. So the first baby is generally a little bit smaller than average. And then after that, the next baby is bigger. And often that will continue with parity. And I actually found in this study that if someone had a previous pregnancy that went late into pregnancy, so say to 28 weeks, the next baby was bigger, as if there had been a previous baby. So there's a clear, it looks like there's a really clear effect of parity on baby size. Now, morning sickness doesn't seem to vary specifically with that. So morning sickness seems to, yes, be a little bit more, I guess, variable. So there are some hypotheses about whether morning sickness is because it's related to the depth of implantation early in pregnancy. And so if parity is related to morning sickness, that would be really interesting because it might suggest that or be some evidence to support that. So I must admit, I will look into that in more detail now that you've mentioned that.
Awesome. And actually related to the effects of parity, the next question follows on quite nicely. Are there sex differences in the relationship between placental weight and birth weight? I mean, the sex of the baby, the question asker says.
Yes. Yes. So male babies are generally larger than female babies. So that's very consistent. And the placental weight to fetal weight ratio doesn't seem to change according to the sex of the baby, but there are clear differences in nutrient supply and access to nutrients. So a male baby extracts much more nutrition from the mother than a female baby does, and how this was initially found is because of the impact that it has on the interbirth interval and the next baby. So when the baby is a male, it has a bigger impact on reducing the size of the next baby if they're born close together rather than if as a female baby. So it's clear that there are differences, and in the stress models that I mentioned really briefly, where synthetic glucocorticoids are administered in animal studies, so it's quite clear in those studies that there are sex differences. So it's possible that these are being masked in a study like this because of the ability of the placenta to respond.
Okay, thank you. The next question is quite long, so I'm going to read it slowly and I'll put it up in 3 parts because YouTube doesn't let you put long questions. So this is from Rose Stevens, who says, "Thank you for a great talk. The morning sickness findings are very interesting and sad to hear it's so understudied." We can agree with that one. "Do we have data on global variation in morning sickness? What drives a geographical variation in it? Is it associated with altitude or anemia, as you mentioned earlier? Was it associated with miscarriage? Do you think it has an ultimate function to modulate reproductive investment in the fetus, or more of a proximate pathological side effect of pregnancy?" Lots of questions, she says. So maybe I'll go to the first one and you can kind of do them in order.
Yes, great. So yes, for some of the early theories that were developed about morning sickness, people did collect and were able to demonstrate quite a bit of evidence around the idea that morning sickness was higher in individuals that were consuming things that were more likely to be higher in pathogens, so meat, dairy, things like that. So that's where the fetal protection hypothesis came from. So that was really influential for a very long time. Our understanding is that at the moment is that morning sickness is almost universal. So the really interesting group in terms of morning sickness are people who don't experience morning sickness. And we're trying to investigate that and the grading of morning sickness that different individuals may experience. In terms of, so the next question was about altitude and anemia. So I must admit, I don't actually know of any information about that at the moment. So if Julie was here, she would really be able to tell us about that. And same with miscarriage. So we still feel that obviously anyone who's experiencing severe morning sickness at the moment won't want me to say this, but we still think morning sickness is good. Okay, so when someone is experiencing morning sickness, and for many people it will be their first sign that they are pregnant, it's a really good sign. So do try and embrace that if you can, but obviously morning sickness is very annoying how it doesn't just occur in the morning. So does it modulate reproductive function? So that's what we're trying to really investigate at the moment. Julie's reviewing this literature and is trying to establish whether there are specific pathways that link the early environment or the current environment to morning sickness that may influence reproductive function. So that's one of our key aims at the moment, and we're really hoping we'll be able to share that with you in the next couple of months. So it's coming along very well.
Okay, next question is my question. Obviously, thank you for a great talk.
Thanks.
Has your research looked at iron transfer? Because some researchers have suggested that low iron during pregnancy, like you said, so is an evolved mechanism during pregnancy to protect the fetus from the effects of iron transfer during pregnancy. But also anemic mothers are more likely to have fetuses with poor weight gain. I guess I'm just interested in, because you talked about iron a little bit and anemia a bit more. But do you think that there's kind of a space for your research to include specifically iron and kind of the fight for iron between the mother and the fetus?
Yes. So that's excellent question. I'm just trying to think of what we have available, because most of our pregnancy information is from medical records. So where most mothers would only have one iron measure, unless there's something that needs to be monitored, and then they would have serial iron measures. Something that is closely related, hope you don't mind, so this is just me trying to link things together, is blood pressure. So during pregnancy, so really early in pregnancy, blood pressure drops. So I think it's to do with, how many blood vessels there are and the diameter of the blood vessels. So very early in pregnancy, blood pressure drops, and then, everyone's familiar with how then blood pressure increases during pregnancy. And it looks like that, along with things like morning sickness and possibly iron availability, are reducing the supply of nutrition and oxygen to the fetus. And it looks like that actually stimulates placental growth. So it may be that there's some synergy there between that early environment that I guess is caused by the physiology, and then the subsequent increase in placental growth that then might translate into morning sickness if we have deep implantation. So a lot of these ideas have been around for a long time. So when people were putting DOHAD together with evolutionary theory, so there's quite a bit of evidence from the animal literature that farmers put sheep into poor paddocks early in pregnancy, which stimulates placental growth and increases fetal growth. And evidently, I don't know firsthand, but evidently they do that on purpose to maintain and support or increase probability of successful pregnancy. So it's quite possible that rather than these things changing linearly over the pregnancy, which we are sort of trained to think about, maybe there's actually some changes that influence each other throughout pregnancy. So that's my best shot at that answer, but I can definitely do better in the future.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I have another question, but there's another question from the form, and my question ties in quite nicely. So I'll ask the form one first. In a similar fashion to how birth weight values are currently being collected and recorded electronically for public health research on national scales, could you one day foresee a future where this is also done routinely for certain placental characteristics? What challenges do you believe would be most present in setting up such a system?
Excellent. So this is a great question. I'm just going to I'll talk, but I'll try and turn the light on. Okay, so this is an excellent question, and looking at the moment. So this with Placental images.
We just lost you a little bit, actually. There was some interference.
Sorry. Cool. Okay.
But we can see you now.
So with our placental images, so you can see how I measured them on sort of a white background, and sometimes there was a bit of a blood splatter. And so we've been looking at artificial intelligence and whether we can use that to measure placentas. And then, you know, in a dream world, we would have a situation where a midwife could have an app. They could scan a placenta and it could provide some information back, you know, for the medical record, and also for that may be able to help with the management of pregnancy. So there's a few people around the world who are working on this idea, trying to use AI to measure placentas. And so the first challenge that we're coming up with is how to do this cheaply, because it looks like the key problem is the background. So being able to separate the background from the placenta, and then the AI being able to pick up the characteristics of the placenta, because they're all shades of pink and red, which is a problem. So that's a great idea. When I first started this, I thought that that's what I would be doing. And it's really interesting, actually. Both hospitals that participated in this study, they had space for placental weight on their medical records, and they actually measured placental weight, and they used to retain placentas as well. So I don't know whether, again, I know it's early in the morning, but many of you may know that placentas used to be a basis for cosmetics. So placentas were actually kept from hospitals and then used for that. So they were routinely measured and collected, but for a different reason. So I'm sure it would be possible to do it again. And actually, if you're interested in this, there's some excellent work where placental histology has been compared across different countries. And that, I think, is the beginning of this. So the first step in this is trying to understand what the variation is. For example, Beverly Strassman is working with people in Mali, and she's been collecting placentas, and a lot of those placentas have parasites. So you can see the environmental variation that we need to understand before we can try and map placental characteristics across countries. And so, yeah, so you can see why people go for weight rather than some of these more detailed characteristics.
Thank you. And I guess on that, I mean, this has been super interesting for me because I don't study placentas at all. So it's been kind of nice to think about what happens during and after pregnancy, because I focus on non-pregnancy. But I was interested in kind of your methodological question about weight of placentas alone not necessarily being the greatest measure. And I was wondering if people look into things like the weight of the placenta as a function of the weight of the mother, or like weight gained or lost during pregnancy, not fetal weight, but like fat of mother, and whether that could be used as a kind of life history trade-off outcome.
Yes. Excellent question. Yeah, I've been thinking about a lot of those things while working with this data. So, and we do have maternal weight. So in the questionnaire, we ask for usual maternal weight, and then we have weight at for those in the public system when they started their antenatal classes, and then we have weight when the baby's born. And, you know, for everyone we have, or for most people, we have at least those two measures. And that measure works really well most of the time. And then I noticed that people who are very heavy can actually lose weight during pregnancy. And so I think that So that's sort of when I stopped examining that, because I was thinking, so for example, with the placental tissue, we've just run a study where we're looking at kisspeptin in diabetic pregnancies and non-diabetic pregnancies, and we found nothing. And then we realized afterwards it's probably because all of these pregnancies are being managed, so they don't really reflect just what would happen if the pregnancy was left to continue on. So the same thing I think is happening with weight. So the weight between normal weight to delivery, so the weight gain during pregnancy, doesn't necessarily reflect anymore what it used to. But if it did, then that's really useful. Yeah. So we do use birth weight as a function of that, and placental weight as a function of that. And also something else that we managed to pick up, so the babies. So I know in a lot of hospitals now, parents only stay in hospital after the baby's been born, maybe for just one day, is quite common now. Luckily, in our study, a lot of pregnancies were staying in for 4 days, particularly in private hospitals. And that was really interesting because we could actually look at how much weight the baby lost and whether it started regaining weight after it was born. And so I'm wondering whether that might be a really good measure of parental investment, because once they're outside of the uterine environment and it drops off, does that suggest that there was a lot of flow of resources in the uterine environment? Yeah. Cool.
Thank you. Lots and lots to think about. And I think that's it for the questions. Lots of questions. So thank you for bearing with us as we made our way through all of them. And that's taken us up to an hour and a half. So I think it's a good time to end. Thank you so much, David, for joining us this week. It's been really, really interesting. And do join us next week. I'm just going to double check. I should have probably done this before, but I think we are at the normal time next week, which would be 3:30. And yes, okay, so next week we've got Dr. Catherine Amato talking about the human microbiome and health inequities, and that will be at 3:30 UK time. So please do come to that, and thank you very much, David, for joining us today. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you.